So I've been thinking of a way to kind of make sense of an abstract concept when it comes to genetics. And what I want you to do is think about the telephone whisper game. And it is, in some respects, similar to the changes that take place on our DNA strand. I remember playing the telephone game perhaps when dinner conversations became a little too political or perhaps too religious, and somebody would whisper a phrase in my ear and say, pass it on, and you'd whisper it in somebody else's ear, and they'd pass it on. And interestingly, by the time you got to the end, the word or the phrase would be entirely different. So this is what we're seeing here. We're seeing one individual, and we want to think of them as generation one, if we want to make that connection to genetics. So generation one has a particular genetic code, and that's passed on to the next generation, the haplotype. And sometimes minute changes in that genetic code. Let's draw some DNA up here. Sometimes we get a change somewhere on that strand, and sometimes the blocks, they're passed on without an issue. Either way, we have the first individual, generation one, saying peas. The second generation, either here they've heard the word wrong or perhaps they say it differently. And instead of saying bees, generation three hears bees. So generation three. And they pass on what they thought they heard or what they're trying to pronounce, and it comes across to generation four as knees. And they say that particular word knees, and it comes across as cheese. And by the time we get to generation five, they're saying fleas. So here we're seeing change over the course of time, and we're imagining we have a number of different generations. Now, as pointed out, genes pretty much work in the same way. We're inheriting a haplotype independently from our mother and independently from our father. And sometimes there's hotspots or areas that change slightly over the course of time. We want to call that a SNP, a single nucleotide polymorphism. And that is what we're interested in tracking when we're looking at haplogroups. These small changes that take place on a DNA strand that allow us to track genetic relationships over time. Let's move to the next slide, and I'll give you an example here looking at peas, bees, knees, cheese, and of course, fleas. Okay, so here we have those 5 words that moved through each generation or each individual, starting out with the word peas. The second word was bees, knees, cheese, and fleas. Now, if we look at this, we do see some similarities. Looking at the way it's spelled, of course, it's different here, but what we're seeing is that N, that ease, if we listen to that, okay, if we listen to what we're hearing, p, ease, b, ease, n, ease, ch, ease, f, ease. So what we're hearing is that kind of that ease sound either way at the end. We want to think that or think of that as a haplotype block. So this is one of the areas on DNA. We'll go in a little bit deeper depth in a few minutes. Say we have some DNA here. It's twisted and tangled. That's okay. We've got some DNA, and we've got a block here that's being passed from generation 1 to generation 2, very much in the same way that it existed originally. However, if we look at the beginning of each of these words, we're getting a p, b, n, ch, f. Okay, we're going to call that a hotspot, and this is also true for genetics. So while we do have these blocks that by and large are unchanged from one generation to the next generation, we also get hotspots on our DNA. And these hotspots they tend to be prone to change, genetic change, or prone to mutation. And words are the same. I want you to think of, for example, papa. Okay, so we refer to our father, for example, as papa. Not everybody says papa. Some people say it with an inverted sound, papa, papa. So if you were in Russia or if you were in Greece, you wouldn't say papa, you'd say papa. If you were in areas of, for example, the Ukraine, Croatia, Eastern Europe, you wouldn't say papa or papa, you would say tata. So we're seeing those minute changes. In either way, the word doesn't change entirely. So here we have a hotspot, the P, the B, the KN, the CH, and the FL. Okay, so here's a starter. Now, DNA, as we've pointed out in previous lectures, there's a lot of base pairs here, over 3 billion base pairs, and if we were to take our DNA and stretch it out, it would go from the Earth to the Moon and back 8,000 times. So there's a lot of stuff that we really need to look at when we're tracing haplotypes and haplogroups and change over time and connecting populations. But here we're looking at the most simple understanding of how these genes change over time and how we're able to track them. So let's start off simply here looking at DNA, and we're going to say, or at least try to make a comparison between DNA there, DNA as a sentence. And mind you, these would be very long sentences. I'm going to keep them short. So let's think about I have an idea, or the United States of America is next door to Canada. Looking at these basic sentences, they can be said in different ways while maintaining the original meaning of that sentence and some of the blocks. But some of these areas do have hotspots. So, for example, I don't know if anybody's had the opportunity to go to New Hampshire. I used to love climbing in New Hampshire, climbing ice out there, climbing rock and mountains. A great place to go. They also say things just a little bit differently than we would in Canada. I have an idea there becomes I have an idea. So referring back to, and I'm going to use green again here, for our blocks, okay, that's unchanged. That's a block that's been passed on from one generation to the next generation. Have is another block that remains unchanged. And, well, I have a spelling mistake, and that's okay. We should always go through our editorial process, and perhaps that's part of the mutation here. I'm going to use it and go with it. I have an, and now we have a hotspot. Okay, so I'm going to circle those or block those off. At the end, I have an idea becomes I have an idea. The same can be said of the sentence, the United States of America is next door to Canada. What we're going to see here are some more significant changes, but ultimately the sentence is going to continue to make sense. So in New Hampshire, you would say the United States of America is next door to Canada. And again, going through this, I'm going to first highlight the blocks. So it's unchanged, United States of America is next door, not all of it, to Canada. And we're going to stop there. And then we get our hotspots. So our hotspots here are going to be the CA and the OR and the A. Hampshire, they wouldn't say the United States of America is next door to Canada. They're going to say the United States of America. That hotspot, that's changed. We're going to call that, if we want to make that connection, we're going to call that a snip. Dowa, that's going to be another snip. And Canada, that's going to be a final snip there. But if we look at the sentence, we can't confuse that it did come from the previous sentence, of course, with a few changes, mutation. Not that we want to say that anybody's dialect is a mutation. Mutations aren't bad either way. We're all mutants. Nonetheless, what we're looking at here are some minor changes that don't change the meaning of the sentence. And this allows us to connect ourselves over time. And as I've pointed out, depending upon the genetic test that's being done, humans are 99.7 to 99.9% genetically identical. If we look at these two sentences, they are very similar. I'm not sure what the percentage is going to be. We're not concerned about that because we're just using this as an analogy. However, if we had something that said the United States and my fridge is empty and I'm hungry and I need to go to the store, instead of the United States of America is next door to Canada, we'd say, whoa, that is a huge change and perhaps represents a different species. So when we're looking at humans, our sentences never change enough for us to say, what? That's not what that sentence says. We get slight dialect changes. So in each sentence, some blocks, they ultimately remain the same. However, others, they're prone to those dialectical influences, or the influences of our dialect and our founders. Okay, so the individuals who founded areas of New England, a little bit different than individuals who perhaps founded, we'll say, Nova Scotia, okay, Scottish. So we're going to hear those dialect differences between those two groups of people, just in the same way that we're going to see some genetic differences between them as well. So I've said DNA, we're going to make that connection to it being a sentence or a very, very long sentence. And here, okay, it's a silly sentence. I was trying to think of what might work. And we're just going to say the house runs on city water. You put it in your mouth and you drink it. Well, it makes sense either way. I don't know if we'd ever say, well, I put the water in my mouth, but that's fine. We're not doing grammar here. So the house runs on city water. You put it in your mouth and you drink it. Now, what we're going to find again, we can say, okay, there's going to be certain areas here that we can consider as a haplotype block. And other areas that we're going to refer to as hotspots for single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. So here I'm just going to roughly do it, and then we're going to come to another slide in a second. We're going to say that that is a haplotype block that tends to be passed on from one generation to the next generation with a lot of similarity. We're going to say aus is also a block, runs on se, and we'll add in the y, the wa, and the, a little bit difficulty there, okay, the water. You put it in your mouth and drink it. Now I'm going to put in the hotspots. We're going to say that H is a hotspot. The T is a hotspot. T is a hotspot. Oh, we'll put a T here as a hotspot. TH is going to be a hotspot. And at the end, T is going to be a hotspot as well. So think here about the way that somebody in Canada, for example, or the United States, or even England would say the house runs on city water. You put it in your mouth, hopefully not the house. You put it in your mouth and drink it. Okay, so I've become a little fancier here. The house runs on our hotspots here. The T's tend to be hotspots, the TH, the D, and the T at the end. And let's think about the way that this might be said in just kind of traditional UK. If you're saying this in English, the house runs on city water. You put it in your mouth and drink it. I'm sorry if my accent isn't bang on, a wonderful accent. Now, I want you to think about the way that this might be said in another area, in London, the UK, and here we're going to look at Cockney, another very interesting accent, a type of dialect. And in fact, if you're interested in looking more at linguistics, take a look at their rhyming phrases. Absolutely fascinating. Either way, we're not doing a course lecture here on linguistics. We're just taking a look at how to make these connections so we can make greater sense out of haplotype blocks, hotspots, SNPs, and of course, haplotype groups. So we have a change that's taken place, a dialect change in those hotspots, and we no longer have the house runs on city water. Instead, we have the house runs on city water. The T, the H that was originally there, that's disappeared. The T, that's disappeared. The T has disappeared. Moving on to the second sentence, you put it in your mouth and drink it. You put it, a little bit softer there perhaps, in your mouth and drink it. So again, we've lost that T that was originally there. Other T is softened. The TH, it has disappeared and it has been replaced with an F, mouth, and D has disappeared, drink, and we've softened the T. Either way, when we look at this, we can clearly see that this second generation here is related to or descends from the original group. The sentence, it still makes sense either way, if we're hearing it in a traditional UK accent or if we're hearing it in a Cockney accent, and it might take us a little bit of time to acclimatize to different dialects around the world, but either way we still know that they're saying that the house runs on city water. We put it in our mouth, the water of course, not the house, and we drink it, being the water. So we've seen a couple of SNPs here. Another way that we could identify this is G1. We're going to call that G1. We're going to say that this is a haplogroup. And when we look at G2, we're going to call that a new haplogroup because we're seeing significant SNPs in it or changes, mutations in the way words have been said. Okay, so hopefully that allows you to conceptualize an abstract concept in a different way, something that we regularly deal with and something that we hear around us in a multicultural society. We do hear those differences. And the way that we hear those differences, molecular anthropologists are able to track those differences on our DNA strand. And in the end, what we end up seeing are connections between populations. So here I'll work back to from the first maternal haplogroup to exit Africa. In their genes, we can see previous generations. So the very first group that we trace mitochondrial DNA to in Africa is referred to as haplogroup L. Haplogroup L is approximately not quite that old. Oh, we're going to say around 200,000 years of age. YBP. And haplogroup M, it has markers from L3, which is a subclade of L, so a subgroup that began to migrate away from Central Africa and eventually settled in areas of the Sudan and Ethiopia. And we also see that original genetic code there as well. the haplotype that's traced to that haplogroup, L. Following this, eventually M, it pushes out further. M migrates. And traditionally, anthropology, we had assumed that people went to Europe immediately. Well, that was a very Eurocentric type of model. We know that that's not what happened. M migrates out. Usually, anthropologists here are pointing to the Horn of Africa and into the Arabian, through the Arabian Peninsula, and eventually over to India. And then eventually we see a new group emerge around 60,000 to 50,000 years ago. Okay, in around there, YBP, and we refer to that group as N. And they were individuals that were the first ones to settle the Far East. We don't want to say that these individuals are Chinese or Japanese or any other regions there, because they weren't. When we're looking at Chinese populations, they do have these genetic markers, but they are a modern population. So these are kind of the first peoples of the Far East. And when we look at their genes, we see that they're connected to M, L3, and L. So again, this allows us to track through time not only the genetic relationships, but the migration patterns as well. So that's the maternal haplogroups. And this is very simple here that I've pointed out. There are many different maternal haplogroups. We're just taking a look at the first couple of groups that moved out of Africa and began to settle different regions by about 50,000 years ago. We also have paternal haplogroups. Yeah, I'm going to try and squeeze an A in there because I really don't want to redo this right now for you. I will at a later date get this in before your test. So we have paternal haplogroups, and the first paternal haplogroup in Africa that we trace our ancestry to is defined as A, and it is approximately 250,000 years old. Now, we do have subclades as well of A, but eventually from A, we get a group that we refer to as B, T. BT, it has, for example, if we look at that, we have the haplogroup there in its genes A, and eventually they follow pretty much the same path as the maternal haplogroups, which is going to make a lot of sense. And we get something that's referred to as CT. CT has the genes of BT, it has the genes of A. Again, we're tracking those haplogroups over time and the genetic changes. So CT represents the first population out of Africa that represents a new haplogroup. And now the changes continue. So, branching off from this, we get something, for example, it's referred to as CF. You've got CT there, you've got BT there, A as well, and then eventually CF down the road leads to H. And H is a dominant haplotype, haplogroup that we find in European populations. So if we took a look at H and we went backwards, we're going to see CF there, CT, BT. All the genetic changes or the SNPs that have occurred over time in those haplogroups are represented in H, and many more. So again, really building upon the idea of our interconnectedness as a species, 99.7 to 99.9% genetically identical. We can see these connections. There's no question that modern humans first emerged in Africa, spread out from there, went to India, went to the Far East, went to Australia, progressed up into northern regions of Asia, eventually spread to the Americas, and eventually spread to Europe as well. And that is the story of humankind.